Welcome to our first lecture on the series that Chronicles season. Tim's put together a very informative series for us this season. And I'm Molly DeMello. I'm the president of the Historical Society. We're all glad you're here tonight. And I also just wanted to give a quick announcement. If anybody's doing the walking tour or would like to this weekend with Tommy Burgess, we're doing the rain date on Sunday instead of Saturday. So it's going to be sunshine and beautiful on Sunday. And a reminder about our membership. Our membership for the Historical Society does expire May 31st. So if you haven't renewed your membership, we'd love it if you would do that. Tim? Tim's
well, thank you, Molly.
Jump in from here.
Okay, this is my first night as the chronicler, and I'm really excited to introduce. I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Michael Pregot, and I was really impressed by the quality of speaker that we have here tonight. Dr. Pregot has a doctorate in educational leadership from Boston University, a Master's of Arts degree from Framingham State College in School Administration, and a bachelor's degree from St. Francis College, where he majored in French and Spanish. Have you ever heard such a wide educational background? It's incredible. But even more important than that, Dr. Pregot has spent over 50 years serving in the field of education for children and young people. And isn't that one of the most important jobs we can have? So I think we should just say thanks for that. Former junior high principal, too. So with that, he's now been on the Cape for over 25 years, where he's devoted himself to researching and studying and delving into the history here on the Cape. And he's really going to share something special with us tonight. And just to cue this up, I think one of the most important reasons why I wanted to get this on the calendar is so often when we think of the Civil War and abolition and slavery, we think about what? Gettysburg and Antietam and battlefields and Abraham Lincoln. And we don't realize that this conflict tore communities apart right here where we lived and all across our country. And so I'm really looking forward to what Dr. Pregot has to share with us about how this conflict that very much shaped our country also shaped our communities here on the Cape. So Dr. Mike?
Thank you, Tim. Thank you.
And you should be ready to go. No
Can I try the mic? Is it better with the mic or without the mic? We've heard him speak. With the mic, you like? Better? Okay, I'll keep the mic on. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Mike Pregot. I am an educator, so I'm not a historian. When you do history books, theoretically, you need to be trained in technique, how to be a historian. So I'm not that. I am just a very interested person in history. And I love reading, I love researching, I love doing examination on things. That's how I got involved. In fact, I'll tell you how I got involved with teaching, researching maritime history. I played golf in Brewster, the Captain's Golf Course. And if you know that course, there are 2 golf courses. Every hole is named after an individual. So you got Captain Ellis, Captain Young, Captain Chase, and so on, all these different captains. So I went to the pro about 7 years ago, and I said, "Where is the book?" He said, "What book?" I said, "I want to know who these people are. What do they accomplish? Why is their name there? Do they have a ship? What's the deal?" He said, "I have nothing." So I began spending about 1.5 years, 2 years writing that book on those people. And then once I did that, it's like, it was easy, because after that, you find out so many. You could drive in Cape Cod, and just pick a road, look at the name, they'll see like Captain Hamlin, Captain this, Captain that, say, who is that guy? What do they do? You can find a lot of history of Cape Cod everywhere if you just put your mind to it. So, well, thank you all for coming. You could be home watching the Red Sox lose tonight. So thank you for coming here. I didn't. Thank God there's no game tonight. I guarantee they will lose tonight. Okay, so we're going to talk about slavery and abolitionism in Cape Cod and so on. So as you can see, I'll begin with a book written in 1832. And as Tim said, people think that the North had no slaves and the South had all the slaves. That's far from the truth. Not true at all. They had slaves in every town. In the census report, even in Cotuit, I looked at this fairly recently, in the year 1774, there were 9 black slaves in Cotuit. So they were everywhere. I mean, just you can't say they weren't here or there. Every town in Cape Cod had black slaves. So as you can see, this guy wrote a book. He's an anti-slavery book. He was friends with Garrison. And by the way, you're right to say that the center of abolitionism is right in here. Rialto and Cotuit is really, really big for anti-slavery. I'm going to show you some pictures, some names about some people who were there. Okay, next, Tim. So one of the founders of the town of Falmouth was a guy named Hatch, and he had slaves. He had indigenous slaves. So when I talk about slavery, there's like 4 to 5 different kinds of slaves. You had black slaves, you had white slaves. How do you have white slaves? Well, back then they didn't have prisons. So if you committed a crime, if you robbed a bank or hurt somebody or did some horrible felony, you would be assigned to labor, hard labor. And it's very much like slavery. They just they'd like lock you up at night and couldn't go out. You were enslaved. So you got black, indigenous, and you had indentured servants, you have voluntary and involuntary. So there's all kinds of levels of slavery when you think about it. We'll talk about that some more. But this guy Falmouth, Hatch from Falmouth, he got him to be very friendly with indigenous people. So what he did basically was he made a lot of deals. In fact, on his tombstone, if you go to visit his tombstone in Falmouth, he said, "Friend of the Indians," and he was. So here's a Bible he put together. He wrote a book for the Wampanoags, so they could understand the Bible. So that was interesting. What you don't know, though, when he made these deals, he gave parties, lavish parties, with a lot of alcohol, with a lot of treats, a lot of unusual things, way into the night. So there'd be wines and dines and good mood. And then at 1 o'clock in the morning, after they're half in the bag or whatever, he would say, "Time for a treat. Let's make a treat. You're going to get that land away. You want to get that land away? You want to sell your property?" So it really wasn't a very fair situation for him at all. Okay, next. The other thing which you think about too, when you think about racism, race in general, on Cape Cod or anywhere, the Wampanoags or the indigenous people in general, they couldn't marry white people. That wasn't even a thought, wasn't even a possibility. They could marry within their own race, if they could, or they could marry a black person, a slave, if they wanted to, or they were pretty limited. There weren't a lot of choices available. So when you see slaves in general, it's not uncommon to see there's both indigenous, black, and sometimes Hispanic, all different people, races in one group. So that was, you couldn't tell them apart. Obviously, half the slaves they looked at had a Wampanoag mother. So they're black and Wampanoag, the blood was definitely mixed between the two races. Okay, next. The Quakers were kind of the first religious group who were against slavery in a very big way. So in Falmouth, the founder came here, actually, Mr. Fox came here in a general way, and what they would do, once they found there were slaves here, they said, well, let's buy them. So they would go, a representative or a Quaker would often go to a camp or to a house and say, oh, you have a slave, Jeremiah, what did you pay for him? And then they started negotiating. If I gave you X amount of dollars, could I buy his freedom? Could I buy him from you? And then they would try to free him. So it didn't work all the time, but they tried it, and it did work to a degree. So he did that. In fact, there was a fellow named Benjamin Gifford from Falmouth. I was reading about him. He had a slave. He was 35 years old, and he negotiated a salary. And the minute he paid the fee, they let him go. They call it a fancy word, manumission. So if you use the word manumission, that means it's the freeing of slaves. Did you hear me use that word? Okay, next. As I mentioned to you before, have you ever gone to 6A, where the courthouse is? They had one of the old jails there. We didn't have jails. In the 1600s, early 1700s, there were no jails at all. This did not exist. If they had anything, they had maybe something that looks like a cave almost, or something that looked like a hole in the ground, and they could fit maybe 2, 3, 4 people in there for a night or two. It wasn't like a long-term thing. You could never keep people forever in this thing. So that's why prison systems really were not adequate. So they never had anything like that. So, for example, if you killed a sheep back in the year 1750, you got 7 years of hard labor. If you took a wooden chest, was 18 years. So just looking at the assignments of what people who were given who were arrested and what the fee was, that could be white or Indian. The difference though with what the whites could do, the white people could do, they could negotiate. So let's say I got arrested for stealing a horse. Well, what I could do, number one, if I got caught, I have to pay a fee to do that, then I don't go to jail. I could, sometimes in some cases, they let their sons or daughter do the thing for them. Or they had a slave, and the slave could serve the time for them. So I could be a white man accused of a crime and not do any time at all, but have my slave do the time for me, which seems completely doubly unfair for all the way around when you think about it. Okay, next. The Quakers too began looking at Mashpee, of course, where most of the Wampanoag tribe went. And they began looking at that. The Quakers say, well, how are these people treated? So they did a kind of a detailed study in the year 1757, and they found two things. They found that every indigenous slave, every indigenous person had a master. So if you were living in town, you weren't like just having a tribe and you were doing your own thing. If you lived in that town, you had somebody you had to report to. It could be a male or female, but he or she was your master. And then they would have to, do what they wanted them to do. It wasn't very nice either. Sometimes kids were raised even at the age of 6. The difference though between the black slaves and the indigenous slaves, black slaves, your children and grandchildren in perpetuity are slaves. I call it chattel slavery. So you were slaves forever. Whereas if you're an indigenous slave, typically 5, 10 years maybe, and then that was it. But you didn't do anything more than that, and your children were not involved at all. So that was one big difference. But here's the woman. This woman she had a master, and she wasn't treated very well at all. I read about her life. Okay, next, Tim. One of the very first ministers, and this really surprised me. Most of the ministers and deacons had slaves. You would think if anyone wouldn't have slaves, you would think it would be the religious people. But that wasn't the case in the Cape. Many of the deacons, many of the first minister, Palmer was the first minister in Falmouth, and he came over, he had at least 3 indigenous slaves and 3 black slaves as well. He had one slave called Cotuit, who can tell you something about that family. They turned out to be a very interesting family. They made a lot of money. I'll explain that to you a little later on. Next. Also in Falmouth too, this guy, Ray, this is a gentleman, Annis B. Ray. His mother, the mother's name is Annis Ray. He's the son of Annis. She, in 1840, rather, in 1940, she got a group of women, 70 women, 70 white women and 3 black women, to sign a petition. Washington, D.C. was being formed, and they were debating whether there should be slavery in Washington, D.C. I don't remember to be in the right lane here, so. So they gave it. What do you think happened when they gave Congress a petition that said, we would prefer you to consider not having slaves in Washington, D.C., signed by women? Women couldn't even vote, so they had no status at all. So of course, they wouldn't even entertain it. They didn't even look at the document, so they kind of a waste of time. But she had a son, this is her son, who became very famous. He went to New York City and became very, very famous. He became the pastor of the biggest church in New York City. Became very, very well known for what he did. And he was also a runaway slave captain. After people would report to him and say, who's running away, where are they going? He would arrange for people to make the trips throughout the North. Okay, next one. So his paper, right here, his name was Charles Ray, that was the daughter of Annis Ray. So he had a paper in New York City called the Colored American, which was an anti-slavery newspaper. It ran in the 1830s and 40s. And it was very popular. A lot of people liked seeing that newspaper. It explained all the unusual things, the quirky things, and the facts about slavery. So a lot of the rich people who are in New York City began reading this and say, well, this doesn't seem right. So eventually more and more people kind of turned to being anti-slavery. He was a good friend to his friend Douglas. They spoke together a couple more than one time. All right, Tim, next. Now the reason that's the cover for my book, that's my book here. So by the way, when I'm finished, if you're interested, I have 2 little books here if anybody would like to buy. Only $20, no tax, I'll give you a break. But you're not bounded, but I'd appreciate it. You're not bound to do it now. The reason I picked that particular cover, I remember when I was a young kid, maybe you do too, having a little box. Remember the March of Dimes? You have like a little wooden box, a little cardboard box, and people put in quarters and nickels and dimes and everything.
Unknown caller.
So being promoted right here. So that was his idea. He began as a slave trader. In fact, he used to bring cotton from the plantations up to the textile mills up in Lowell and Lawrence. And then he did that for a few years and he got very tired of doing this. I can't do this. This is not right. I'm helping, even though I'm not directly slave trading, I'm helping the concept of slavery, like doing the black, like selling cotton. So eventually he began this collection booth. And he was a Quaker, and he really raised a lot of money. The pastor of the town would typically gather the money every month, and then they'd mass together whatever funds they had, and use it to fight pro-slavery people. Okay, next. We're going to talk a little bit about one of the things I try to do in my mind. I try to figure out why would even people think that slavery is okay? I mean, because I'm using a 20th century, 21st century mentality, which you really can't do. It's really not fair to do that because it's hundreds of years ago. But I try to look at it from the religious, political, social, legal perspective and say, what was it about those times from way back when to now that made it look like slavery be okay? So that's kind of what I'm going to try to do a little bit here now. So let's begin with the history a little bit. So these names that you see right here, these are fellows, they're all English people. They came to America, they all made a lot of money here, but they all were involved with slavery. Okay? One of them was a guy named Sam Maverick. We have a guy, when you call someone a maverick, he's like an exceptional human being. He's like, he can do something out of the ordinary. And he just doesn't follow the norms. He just does strange, unusual things. He's a maverick. Well, he was definitely a maverick. He made a lot of money, and he had a boat. One of the things he made money, he had a boat that went from Chelsea to Boston, and people would take this boat and move their force back to town. Well, one day there was a guy named John Jocelyn, who was a kind of a reporter from England who was on the boat, and he heard a horrible scream at night. He went out to the boat, and there was a woman being raped. And he says, "What's going on? What's happening?" He got hold of Maverick, got hold of the boat owner. He said, "What's happening?" He said, "Oh, it's got nothing to worry about. I told my slave to go on the boat. I told her the name of the woman who she should pick, and I ordered him to impregnate her. I wanted more slaves." So just like a normal thing for them to command that, and that apparently on occasion would happen. Okay, next. Dudley, there's a little passageway in Dudley Square. It used to be called Dudley Square. Now they call it something different. And now they call it the Nubian Square, right? So that's where a lot of the black people would live in Boston. And they said, well, it's not fair to keep his name. He was a second governor, and we had a colony. He said it's perfectly okay to have slaves. Nothing wrong with slaves. He didn't have any slaves himself, but his children, his grandchildren, all of his relatives did. So he was okay with having a number of slaves. Also, the first he began Harvard University in the town of Newton was his idea to begin our first university here in America. Okay, next. John Usher, another individual too. Before we even had governors, we had people who were called dominion takers. They would like keep the money for the English people, and they would show the colonists what to do. Well, this guy was a tax collector, you would say. He was a tax collector for the American colonies. And there's a little patch of land over in Somerville, kind of just out into the water. And he built a beautiful farm with the help of black slaves. So he had probably, at any one time, maybe 20 to 30 black slaves who did the heavy work. They did the farming, they built the buildings, they built the fences, they did masonry. So he was heavily involved in slavery as well. And eventually, he got tired of him. People don't like tax collectors that much. You probably don't know that, but they're not popular people. So they eventually chased him out. He went to New England. He left to New Hampshire. He had left town. He was forced out. Okay, Tim, next.
Oops.
That's okay. Just pass one. Sorry.
There you go.
One more guy we talk about is there was a businessman. He owned a lot of commercial property in Boston. Charles Epstrop. Did you know where the Boston Chapel is? The Boston Hill Chapel. Right in my family's basement today. There's a beautiful church not about a block away. And he was a very, very wealthy man. And he would often collect money from the British people to do, and then American people. They put an ad in the paper. This particular paper, the Gazette, that paper began publishing in the early 1750s. So it's been around for quite a while. But there were ads. I saw ads in the paper. Slaves for sale. Come on Friday. All 14 slaves, and they described them physically, what they're like, and what their skills were. So he was definitely into it. He founded his church. He was a member of the King's Chapel. In the year 1740, there were 55 different congregants who had 219 slaves. So that's a lot of slaves for Boston. Boston back then was not big, probably under 2,000 people. So if you had almost 200, you had that many slaves, that's a lot. That's almost 10% of the population, probably. 2,000 people. Okay? Say the next one. Found another one. Remember, we keep talking about changing the name. We've been talking about this for umpteen years now, right? We haven't done it. But he was a very unusual guy. Made a lot of money by slave trading. When his uncle died, he got even more money, so he built a beautiful building, a provincial building, and he gave it to the city of Boston for free. He just donated the building. Now, it's famous for two reasons. In front of it, we would have a slave market. So it was very common back in the 1740s to have a slave market. So people could come and pick out their slaves if they wanted to. But in the 1820s, became the center for abolitionism. So there's a lot of abolition, all the meetings that were there. Adams and Sam Adams were big abolitionists. A lot of people who were against the net. So you kind of argued each way. That's why in the title of my book, my subtitle is Incongruity, because we are, as a colony, we were the head for New England for slave trading in Boston, but we also eventually became abolitionists, became anti-slavery. We had that movement too. So it's not that it's fair or equal, but we did both. Okay, next. Now, in the 1600s, most of the slaves that we had, I'd say from the Pilgrim days up through the 1700s roughly, most slaves, not many black, most were indigenous. So every time there was like a little rebellion, if an indigenous tribe got a little frisky and they attacked people, they would capture indigenous people. I call them indigenous. They would never use the word, I call them Indians, but I don't know, someone tells me I don't like the word Indian. So I call them indigenous, but they lived here at the time. They lived on that land. And they would be used for barter. So if you were a white American colonial captain who fought against the Indians, sometimes the payment, you'd give like 2 slaves or 3 slaves. That's how they paid you. They didn't pay you in money, but they paid you in slaves. So that was just the way it was. That was brutal. We'll talk about 2 wars too that you should probably know about. What happened to in 1678 became very, some of the indigenous people of Wampanoag became very violent. They knew that they were losing the battle. They knew that their land was going to be taken away from them effortlessly, and a lot of homes were burned. So a lot of people became very fearful of indigenous people. So their danger level raised quite a bit. Okay, Tim. And again, another pastor, the very first pastor, the first church in parish in Truro, he had both the 2 indigenous slaves, a female, and he had 2 black slaves as well. So when he came to his sermons, he would sometimes have his slaves right there and sitting right under his pulpit. So he was like a strong believer in his faith and his belief, but he saw no contradiction in having slaves as a means of going forward. Okay, next. This was a common thing too. So if you were, I say affluent people, I say people in the top 1 to 2% of the population, it was very common to see in Boston and even in Cape Cod. If you went to the movies or you went to a church, you went to something, sometimes you wanted to be known as being affluent, so you would go to a meeting with your slave. I mean, and the people would notice, oh, she's a slave, she must have money. So it was not uncommon at all for people to have slaves in their household and to brag, to boast about, to make boasting about what they did. Okay, next. Born in the year of 1670s, 3 Wampanoag Indians one time raided the house, and they got caught. And as a punishment, they went to the owner and they said, well, here's what we can do. You can keep those people as your slaves forever, in perpetuity. That's their punishment. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody broke into my house and was trying to rob me, I'm not sure I want to keep them in my house forever. I don't think that's a real logical thing to do, but that's the way to handle it. That's just kind of silly, but that's what they did. Okay, next. And there was a lot of underground railroads. We're going to talk about that, but I've been into 3 or 4 homes in Sunburn in Barnstable County, quite a few. The main street at Barnstable, there's a house you can kind of go into it. You could be down in the basement, you can see hiding right there. Have you heard Mary Dunn Road? Do you know where that is? Mary Dunn is a road around 6A. And she was a black woman, and she was the head of the local group, I guess, of the runaway. She came from Barbados, she was black, but she had a pretty big sized farm, kind of where the Cotuit golf course is today, in that neck of the woods. And people would shoot hide people. So once the Luxors got here, they tried to get her name, and they would get her. She would hide them and protect them and move them along. Okay, next. And here's a guy from Barnstable, Shubael Smith, who whipped his slave so severely that the slave died. So you would think he would be punished, and he was, but not in the way you would think. Because what the judge said was, what you did was a horrible, horrible thing. Everyone has a right to live, but you just killed him. You just killed this man. So he said, you have to pay a fee, you have to pay a fine. He paid a fine of, I forget the amount, but some amount of money. And he said, if any other white man does this again, we'll punish him even harsher. So I found that a little contradictory. You know, if he did the deed, why not treat everyone the same, right? Why treat him differently? But he wasn't given too bad a sentence anyway. Okay, Tim, next. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about different religious beliefs. But I found that interesting. I was just trying to figure out why so many deacons and parishes and different would have slaves. It just didn't make a lot of logical sense for me. And the more I looked into their beliefs, the picture of the pilgrims way back when, the pilgrims were that kind of neutral on slavery. They weren't against it, but they weren't for it either. If they had some slaves, they did. They had a few indigenous slaves, no black slaves I know of. They had indigenous slaves, and they were allowed to keep them. But it wasn't like they didn't do it for perpetuity. They didn't have to travel, so they treated them a little bit more humanely, I would say, than some of the other groups. Okay, Tim, next. Probably the biggest religious group on Cape Cod would be the Congregationalists. That is different names, Universalists, sometimes First Church of Christ, different type of name. They were definitely they're more anti-slavery in words, but pro-slavery in action. Why would you think that sea captains, and sea captains were the big contributors to the parishes, right? They made the money and gave the money to the parish. So a lot of parishes had a lot of money to give to churches, but because when you think about it, when you were involved in maritime trade, if you sold cotton, if you sold rum, if you sold molasses, if you brought wood to Africa, and Africa had been with a typical route, they go to Africa, and then from Africa to the West Indies, and they get involved with that trade, and then trade to go to Florida, and so there was kind of a pattern, as you would see, they made some money. So if you were involved as a commercial shipman, you made money. So they always say, we don't want it, but it's always, let's do that tomorrow. We'll get rid of slavery next week. We'll get rid of slavery next year. So they were kind of hedging. They knew they could make money, and they didn't want that to go away. So they kind of, in words, they kind of professed to be, against slavery, but not so much in their actions. Next. There weren't that many Jewish people back then. Maybe 2% or less in the whole country. But there was a tradition in the Jewish faith, if you owed money particularly. But again, that type of slavery is quite different for the Jewish people. You could live in a house. If you owed me a lot of money, you could indenture a daughter or a sister, or a wife, or somebody, a husband, and they could serve you with their needs. But they went home at night, so it was like a whole different thing. They believed in slavery, but not quite the way that we see it today. All right, next. The Catholic view is kind of strange too. The Catholic view, even as late as 25 years ago, they had a papal bull in Catera, which meant that the doctrine of discovery applies. Which means that if you're going to the North America continent, either Canada, America, Mexico, perfectly okay to do slaves as long as you're doing it for the reason of Christianizing. You're going to show the savages how to live correctly. So it's okay to take over the land, it's okay to treat them cruelly, but you're going to ultimately teach them how to live and how to not be savages and how to be good people. So that was a genuine thought. That was so people. In fact, when Columbus had a thing in his, we did his third trade. He did 3 different trips to the New World. He took slaves every time. He had he had a proposition saying, any money that is gathered by the colonies or by England, any group, he's entitled to like 20% of the profit. So he saw slavery for him to big way to make money. He gave Queen Isabella 10 slaves. She said, I don't want these slaves. I do not need slaves. I don't need slaves. So there was a split decision, but you can see the Catholic Church was definitely not strongly against slavery. Anyway. I don't know about you again, but when I was young, I remember marching in the Columbus Day Parade because it was a thing to do. I remember being a high school kid. I was in New York City. I'd march. But when you think about it today, it's not very popular. Columbus Day found out more and more the degradation of people and his ruthlessness and how he treated people. He was very, very ruthless in how he treated people. So they eventually said no. So I can see why now it's indigenous people there more than Columbus Day. That's kind of a mixed bag. All right, Tim, next. The Quakers were the first group that really were against it. So I'll tell you a story about two brothers, John and Moses Brown, the two Brown brothers. John Brown is the founder of Brown University. So there's a picture of Brown when it first came into being in the early 1600s. And he built the university with slaves. He took the buildings, he used the slaves to build them all up. The other brothers was kind of, it wasn't strongly against it, but it wasn't really for it. It was kind of equivocating all the time. So they really didn't get along. It was only until 1770, Quakers were the first religious group that said no more slavery. I found one story which is interesting. There was a guy, right before this, about 10 years before this, they had a national convention of Quakers in Philadelphia. And a guy named Benjamin Lundy went to it. And under his skin, under his jacket, he had a big thing of a pint of pig blood. And he was talking and says, "There shall be no more slavery, or I shall die, I shall kill myself." He takes a knife, plunges it into his chest, and blood splurts out. And people think, "Oh my God, he killed himself." He was just promotional. He did all of this as a show, a demonstration to get people. Now will you vote anti-slavery? They still didn't vote. So it took them 10 years after that to finally get it going. All right, next. You probably know the story, but in the early 1600s, England would come to North America and take slaves. So Squanto, you know that name, right? Squanto was the fellow who was taken by English traders, brought over to Europe, a young kid, he's like 9, 10 years old when he was brought over. He lived in Spain for a while, lived in England for a while, freed as a slave. Finally, some Spanish monks knew he was an American indigenous person, and they found a way to get him back. So when the Pilgrims landed in 1620, this indigenous person walks up to him and says, "Hi, how you doing?" So they spoke English, and they showed him how to fish, showed him how to hunt. So the story is probably true. It's probably not as warm as they portray it today, but he was friendly to them. In fact, if you go to Eastwood Hole Golf Course, on the 14th hole, they have a little marker there. They think that's where he's buried, but I'm not sure. It's some historical confrontation about that. Okay, next. So the two big indigenous wars. We had the Pequot War, was one of the first. That was the first one. It was 1636. A little smaller, mostly in Connecticut, a little bit here in Massachusetts too, where the Indians had an uprising. 700 indigenous people were kept as slaves, and again used as salary, used sometimes for other means, sometimes to build buildings sometimes. But then you had the King Philip's War. That was a much more brutal war. The indigenous people really were getting nervous then. They kind of knew that their land was being taken and they had nowhere to go, and they were kind of nervous about that. So they burned homes and they did some things that were. And it really, when you think about it too, if you had a choice, if you had an indigenous person and you're as a slave or a black slave, the feeling was right around 1700, a black person doesn't know the territory, doesn't know the land, doesn't know the language, comes from another country, doesn't have any connections. But indigenous people, they knew the land, they knew the territory, they had friends, they had sister tribes, they had people all around, and not quite as violent. So there was a decision made that let's move away from indigenous slavery and move more to black slavery. And that was part of this was because of the wars, the indigenous wars. Okay, next. Now we had indentured service too. And there was different kinds of indentured service. One type of indentured service, the typical way, but most of it was pretty good for the most part. So if I was living in particularly England, Ireland, even Germany, I would be maybe a cook, or I couldn't make a living where I'm living. The economy was pretty bad. So what I would do is I would go on a boat, and I'd be brought to America. It was almost like a slave market. When they arrived, these people go look a square, say, "This is a fine lady, she can cook, she can sew, she can do this. This man has a background in agriculture, he can grow crops, and he can move stone walls, and he can," and then they bid the person, and they, that's the way it worked. Sometimes it's prearranged, but when we think about it, I always thought that most indigenous services are prearranged. It's not the case. Most of them were like a bidding system. Most of them came on boats, and then they had to negotiate to get a job somewhere. I even found a case of there are 4 black slaves in Connecticut. They had indigenous slaves, so the slaves could have a slave. So that shows you the social status of slavery. It just wasn't not a very popular thing. Okay, next. Now another thing which again surprised me, you also had a thing called involuntary servitude. So there are men in prison in Ireland, Scotland, and what they would do, they would sometimes take whole groups of men, 20, 30 men at a time, sometimes young boys as early as 15, ship them over here, and they did the heavy lifting, heavy work. So they didn't have a choice about it. It wasn't like they could negotiate that. If you were in prison, whether you served the time in England or whether you came to America, so this guy William Pinchon took advantage of that. He built some of those in Roxbury, Springfield, and they're all involuntary service. I found some in the paper. A slave prison says if you want slaves, here's the price. Just buy them. You can buy our slaves and you can use them. Okay, Tim. The British were big. The British were even more unscrupulous, I think, than we were. British is more. I would say if I had a rank order, I'd say maybe England first, Portugal 2, America 3rd in terms of civil inhumanity towards slavery. They didn't treat people too well. They had to kind of look at which one I could read and so on and so forth. Here's our Hawkins, who's an English guy. He had a herald, and in order to be an official knight or a member of the Royal Society, you had a coat of arms. This coat of arms had a young black slave prominently displayed right on the crest, and that has to be approved by the Queen. So the Queen obviously saw, well, that's how you make the money by selling slaves, so that's okay with me. So it was not, the chief saw that as being perfectly acceptable to have British people do that. Okay, next. This is a story, a story about George Washington. So was he a slaveholder? Yes, he was. There was a woman he had. Ona Washington was a slave. Was originally owned by Ona, by Custis, Martha Custis, the wife. And every time Washington had to move, because the capital area moved from New York to Philadelphia, moved different times in the country's history, the slaves moved with him. So Ona Washington was a woman who, unfortunately, was she was very good at what she did. She was a custom design person. She made dresses and clothing and seamstress. She could do some really good things with clothing. And when she moved to New York, it wasn't that great. When she moved to Philadelphia, she was surprised because a lot of black people in Philadelphia were treated really well. They could go out at night. They can maybe go to a restaurant. They had some freedom. Whereas down in the South, they didn't have any kind of freedom at all. Down in Virginia, Mount Vernon, she couldn't do anything. So she escaped. She got on a boat and managed to get to Rhode Island. So she got to Rhode Island. And now Washington was in a very precarious situation because they came on too heavy. That could really grab her and just take her. The northern people would be up in arms. They wouldn't like that. But if they did nothing, the southern people say, that's property. You're giving away property. In fact, George had to pay a fee to the Custis family for losing a slave. Anytime you lose a slave, you had to reimburse someone for the slave that you lost. So I found that an interesting little side story. Okay, next. When they were brought over, slaves were brought over, think about the conditions they were brought over. They make it look kind of happy as fun over here in this picture, but it wasn't quite like that. I don't see anybody was laughing. They were usually chained. They were usually under the deck, no sunlight, very little food, if anything, getting a little bit of food, could never exercise. In fact, if you were chained next to somebody and he was dying, you were in tough shape because there's no doctors. They're not going to let you go. If he has some kind of incredible disease, you're going to catch it from them. So I'd say probably 30% of the slaves never made it over. They started to come over, but they never quite made it. This is what it really changed for the Quakers. This ship, the Sally, was sponsored by the two Brown brothers. Remember I told you the two Brown brothers, who they were? They gave most of the money for the ship. And even they said they both have to agree. When the ship came over, there was roughly 200 slaves to begin with. There was only like 90-something actually got off the ship. Many of them just committed suicide. Many of the slaves said, if this is the way I'm going to live, I don't want to live. And they found a way to either hang themselves or jump off ship or just club each other to death or they killed each other. So it's really sad. He said, that's inhumane. They both agreed not to have, the Quakers then decided not to have slavery officially banned in our colonies. Okay, next. Now, this is our motto of our very first day. So you have an indigenous person. You see the little band that's around his head, the little thing waving around his head there? It says, come over and help us. So I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure I would, if I'm an indigenous person living in a sovereign country, minding my own business, I don't think I would have a flag that says, come over and help us. I don't think I would do that. So that was the white person mentality. They're coming over to help us. That's what they thought, or that's what they claimed to be. But in reality, that wasn't the case at all. They were being very cruel to indigenous people. So. Okay, just to show you how the thinking of the mindset was a little bit. Okay, Tim, next. So the laws, because then I began looking at some of the laws. And this is one law. This law is supposedly to help slave people. So it says, we allow among us no actions that are inhumane or barbarous. Men cannot be beaten more than 40 stripes for one fact at a time. So, I don't know, I don't want to be struck with a whip one time. But if you can be hit 40 times, that seems pretty cruel to me. It seems pretty, because many people did die from whippings. And they said unless a crime be very shameful, it could even exceed 40. If your crime is shameful enough, it could exceed 40 stripes. So I don't think that's helpful. They thought this was a helpful law for the slaves. All right, next. Here's one that really became an essential thing. We had a judge named Cushing, Judge Cushing. There were 3 court cases that all came up in the 1780s. In the West, there was a woman called Mambet. She was a slave. And her sister was about to be attacked by the owner, a big frying pan, was going to conk her sister on the head. She intervened, tackled the white woman, and there was a court case. And how dare a black slave attack a white woman? So the judge listened to the case and said, so how imminent was it that she was going to be killed? And Mambet said, I'm pretty sure she's done something like that before and someone was killed. So I said, she's going to kill my sister. And the judge said, well, you have a right to defend yourself. You have that right. So she was found, not only was she given her freedom, but she was found not guilty and given her freedom both. So that was the first case. Then there was one more case. Quack Walker was a guy from Barry, Mass, Central Mass, right above Worcester. He had a very mean slave. He would whip the guy all the time, and eventually the judge said, well, how often will you beat? Just about every night. So he said, okay, you're free too. So even though you escaped and you should be in custody, you're free. And in fact, he says, the more I think about it, this is the 3rd case in 2 years where they're being much too harsh. The punishment for slaves is much too harsh. So he says, there shall be no law of official slavery after 1783. Now, did that end slavery? Not quite. So they still did it. A couple ways they did it. We were the first state, the first colony. They said no more slaves. That's legally no more slaves. But what they did was they would go to the slaves, the owner would go to the slave and say, make an agreement. Would you be my indentured servant? I'll pay you money. I won't be a slave, and you could be free. Maybe your son could be released. There's some kind of arrangement. As long as it was mutually consented that between the owner and the slave, they could continue it. But a lot of times the laws just wouldn't even search for it. But even though there was slavery, people just looked the other way. And that was very common as well. Okay, next. Whaling is the one exception to the situation. Whaling, after the more I read about whaling, they had a pathway to become either any kind of slave or not. If you were a black slave, you could make it, let's say, Massachusetts and New Bedford or somewhere in there, even in Philadelphia. The whaling captains would hire you right away. So whether or not you wanted to be a slave or not, you could work on that boat. A lot of times the whaling trips went out for 3 years at a time. So that was perfect. Now they could escape. They couldn't be captured. 3 years they could do work and get paid for it. Sometimes they got their freedom too. After a certain amount of time, they get their freedom too. So that was a really good thing for them. The other thing I found out too is indigenous people. What would happen in Mashpee? If you had a son or a daughter, a particular son, and he was a healthy young lad, he could do some work, they would allow the mother to buy blankets, food, like in a shop. She would buy food. And then they would say to the mother, she would say, okay, you either have to pay me now, you owe me X amount of dollars for everything I gave you, or I will indenture your son for 5 years on a whaling ship. So that's how I said half the people who were whalers before the Revolutionary War, I'd say half of them were had cell phones, and half of them had no obligation to do that whatsoever. Okay, who we do next? Next one. Bowen is he was English, but he was considered the king of the slaves. He would sometimes have as many as 2,000 slaves at one time on his boat. So he was an English guy, but he brought slaves to America. He brought them all over the world. But he brought them to America, he brought them to England, brought them to everywhere. England had a similar problem, but they were treated differently. For some reason, the slaves were not treated as harshly in England, but they were brought there. And then sometimes they were released eventually. One time he got caught with 2,000 slaves on his one ship the night ago. And they were going to have a trial, and lo and behold, the night of the first night of the trial, he managed to escape. And everyone said, how did he manage to escape? How did that happen? And the the guy who ran the jail said, geez, I have no idea. And by the fact he became a little richer, would be my guess. So he ran away. So I talked to you about being a beneficiary of the slave trade. So if you're a slave, if you were a captain, you were a sea captain in Massachusetts or anywhere, if you did cotton, tobacco, rum, you definitely had an indirect benefit from being involved with a slave. So Prince Crowell, I mentioned that was the guy with the box, I showed you about that box. He was involved with the rum trade and sugar cane, even though he wasn't a direct slave trader. Isaac Clark from Brewster, he would sell fish to the plantations. We have a lot of alewife fish, these little tiny fish and shad that run in our streams. He would capture them. People didn't want to eat them. They weren't really that great eating, but he would sell the food to the plantation. So you could take a big money that way. And you got John Bowles, the same thing. He brought food, things which kind of no one here we wouldn't want to eat substandard food, but he would sell to the plantation. So they all profited. So a lot of that, and other people too. So you can see why the sea captains didn't really want to end slavery right away. And Tim, next. Austin Burse has another name from Barnstable. As you're going to drive around somewhere. He was in Rihanna too. He lived in Rihanna, right nearby. He did it for 10 years. He was a slave trader. His job was to take the family to separate them. Father was here, mother was here, child was there. He said after a while, I couldn't stand the noise. It was horrible. The screaming and gnashing of teeth, and these women would cry like crazy. So he kind of gave it up. So he got a job in the Boston Harbor as a sea captain, the harbor master in Boston. And the reason he did that, because he didn't announce it to us, but he was anti-slavery. So every chance he knew about a captain coming in who might have some slaves to be freed, he found a way to get them to be freed. Okay, and by the way, I want to read a book too. Go to the Sturbridge Library. You have to make an appointment if you can. Put on some white gloves. But he wrote a book called Reminiscences of the Slave Trade. He talked about incidences that happened on his boat in the slave trade. And it's a horrible, I wouldn't even tell you some of the stories, but they're really horrible. But you can't read about them directly from his own words. Garrison is another guy from Rihanna. He's a local man. So he was a leader. And he was different than the other abolitionists in that he said immediately, you got to do this right away. You can't do this like a week from now, a month from now. If you're going to end slavery, you got to end it tomorrow. I mean, today, not only tomorrow, today. Got to be today. So he kind of led that movement. But there are some other people with him. Richard Dana, Lucy Stone, and Lucy Morris. Okay, the woman who gave the money for this library was an abolitionist. So she was very supportive of the anti-slavery movement. Okay, next. So Lucy Morris's mother was a woman named Abigail. She lived in New York, but she was involved with a lot of different things. She was an asshole, she just had money. But she wanted to free slaves, she was a pacifist, she wanted to have food for the kids. In New York City, the kids were being starved, made to work in factories sometimes at the age of 5. So she fought all of that. Her daughter eventually moved here to Cotuit. She was buried here. Lucy Morris, the woman I spoke about, she was buried here in Cotuit. She continued that tradition. She fought very heavily to fight the slavery rebellion in 1830. Okay, Tim? This guy's named Absalom Boston. He was the first black sea captain to have an all-black crew. He was a whaler, and everyone in his crew was all black. So could you imagine the shock? And that's like in Philadelphia, all these people were at a dock and this all-black crew coming in. So what's going on here? But they had every right. They were all free men, or close to be free, whatever. He had legal permission to be slave traders. Made a lot of money. If you go to Nantucket, go to the Whaling Museum in Nantucket, you'll see his picture right there. His daughter wanted to enroll in public schools in Nantucket, and they said, no, you can't. We don't allow black children to come to public school. And he fought that. And he actually wasn't here alone. There's three families. He eventually won that case. That he did soften the transition period. Okay, Tim, next. Paul Cuffey was another guy. He was actually born in Cotuit, Pennsylvania. But he and his family, his big family, his like in-laws and different things, he began shipbuilding in Westport. And he began, I think, 30 to 40 ships. He became one of the, if not the wealthiest, one of the wealthiest men in America. Big whaling, big family, big reputation. Some president, I think it began with Jefferson and went on to Madison and some other people, they thought that we could end the slavery very simply. You put them on a boat, send them away. Not that simple. Right, it wasn't that simple. So this guy, Paul Cuffey, So I'll be the head of this. And for a while, he was actually thinking about doing it. He was going to be their president. He was a black man. He was going to prove to the president that you can do this. But the more he looked into it, eventually he said no. He said that after giving it a lot of thought and consideration, I withdraw my participation in the AFS for two reasons. Number one, it's inhumane. All men are not created equal if you treat them differentially. That's one thing. But it's just, how expensive it would be to ship millions of people to Africa. So I could make a political comment now, but I won't do that, I promise. Next. And then there's some really unscrupulous captains who are here. Unscrupulous people who, this guy Jack Hammond, for example. This was a picture that was in the Liberator. Liberator was a newspaper that Garrison published in New York and went all across the country, people would buy it. So Hammond would take money from slaves, runaway slaves, pocket that money, and then at some point would actually find a way to get news to the police to capture her, or whoever it is, and then get paid the ransom for the slave. So he collected both ways. He collected from the slave, and then he collected from the owner. So that wasn't very nice. This is what happened here. He took that picture with a famous case of a particular person, Jane Johnson, and that's the picture of Jane Johnson being taken away off the boat from the Hammond ship. Okay, next. There's a guy at Harvard. His name was Jonathan Walker. He was going to save some black slaves. He had about 20 slaves in Florida. And he knew where they were. He was going to take one of them and bring them up to the north and save them. But he got caught. In 1832, there was a Fugitive Anti-Slave Act. So if you got caught helping slaves in any way, giving them money, giving them advice, putting them in shelter, and a runaway, you're breaking the federal law. So when you think about that, all the sea captains in 1780, they would get in trouble if they were pro-slavery, right? Because the law says you can't be a slave legally. But then if you were anti-slavery, you can get in trouble for that, federal law. So that's why it's very hard to find a lot of records on slavery. People just didn't want to talk about it. They may have done different things, but you don't find a lot of diaries and journals and stuff like, oh yeah, I was helping slaves, or I wasn't helping slaves, or whatever. They just don't talk about it. They may have done things, but you don't find a lot of writers about that. Okay, next. Jonathan Bourne, the town of Bourne is named after him. He became a very rich man. He had a big fleet of whaling ships. He became, in 1860, when the Republican Party was founded, he became the head of the Democratic group. So when it came time to elect a president, a nominee for the Republican Party, some people wanted Lincoln, and some people didn't. Some people wanted William Stewart. The Stewart followed that name, okay, with the purchase of Alaska and all that. That's who they wanted. But he kept hard. He kept pushing and trying to get Lincoln to be the presidential nominee. But it was a close vote. So it'd be interesting to see what would have happened. History was just a little bit different. Might have changed our country quite a bit, perhaps. And then we had another guy, Doan. This guy was interesting. This guy, he was the head of the temperance movement, but then he owned the biggest tavern on Cape Cod. So I'm not sure how that works out, but he did. He was also the head of the runaway slaves. So the report gives them to me, but he would say, "Thank you very much. I'll take care of them." He would just put them back to work and put them into slavery. So I don't know how he got away with it, but he was a very wealthy, very cruel, but a very wealthy man. Okay, next. So remember we talked about William Bruce. So that sailboat that you see there is called a Moby Dick. So what would happen if a boat was coming from anywhere in the south, probably the south, more likely, some escaped slaves that wanted to come up to the north. They would go up to a certain point within that sailboat, and then when they got near the port, Bruce would make an arrangement for someone to row out and bring the black slaves into port to free them, maybe Underground Railroad. Now, they would love to come to Cape Cod, because if they can make it to Cape Cod, and they can make it to like Provincetown or anywhere like that, you know they're going to make it to Canada. With the Fugitive Slave Act, you were never safe. So if you were walking around town, any town, Boston, Cape Cod, anywhere, and people said, "He's a slave, let's grab him," they could. So even though you thought to be free when you come to North America or come to a northern colony, that wasn't the case. So they had to keep on going up to Canada. That's why a lot of slaves did immigrate finally towards Canada. Okay? The biggest anti-slavery convention ever was in 1840 in Harwich, not far from the public library. That's where they have the festivals and all that. The sea captains were kind of more pro-slavery. So when Garrison, Lucy Stone, all these famous speakers, Frederick Douglass was speaking, they had one day where they just managed to give their speeches. The second day of the conference, supposed to be a 3-day conference, They got run out of town, literally. I mean, they stormed, they knocked them, poured them down, they chased them in, they had clubs. I don't think anybody got killed, but they really chased all the pro-slavery people, the anti-slavery people out of town all together. So it's kind of nasty. And then in 1860, there was a second one held at the same location. By then, the opposite change was occurring. People thought there was you had to do something. The whole country being split in half by this issue of slavery. Some were for it, some were against it. It was really splitting up the country, so we have to do something. And then at that time, they weren't running the town at that point. Okay, next. So I'll just quickly go through a couple of slaves' names. All these people are black slaves who lived here in Massachusetts. And they're all famous for different reasons. Frederick Douglass lived in New Bedford for many years. Not an educated man formally, but a great speaker. One of the great speeches, if you want to read a really good speech, why does a black man appreciate the 4th of July? Read that sometime. If you read a book, a speech kind of thing, why does a black man appreciate the 4th of July? It's kind of a satiric thing. It's kind of very, I wasn't believing it. They weren't. Okay, next. Adams, if you heard of that name before, Christopher Adams. So the first black man killed, this is before the war, but not too, just a very short period before, we had the Boston Massacre. So the day before, there was a little boy got shot by a British soldier, and I think accidentally, we believe. So he, the next day, Adams, who was a runaway slave from Framingham, but he was free, and some other men were in Boston, and they were agitated. They were being protested in a very active way, and throwing rocks and throwing stones. And finally, he got fired upon, and Alex was the first person killed at the Boston Massacre. So he was a black slave. Okay, next. Phyllis Wheatley, have you heard of her? She's a very famous writer. When she came to, she was, again, not formally educated, but the two sisters, the Wheatley family took her in, and they knew Greek and Latin, the two daughters, taught it to her. She began writing these beautiful poems in Latin and Greek, and the Queen admired her, and Abraham Lincoln admired her. The unfortunate part, though, she married a bum, and she lived in poverty near the end of her life, which is too bad. She was a very talented person. Okay, next. Sojourner Truth, another person. She lived more in the western part of the state, but she was against slavery. She was for women's rights. She was a pacifist, temperance movement. So some of these people crossed over. They were not just one social movement. They wanted more than one social right to be wrong. So she was a true advisor to Lincoln for several of these issues. Okay, next. We're right near the end now. 1, 2 more. Sergeant Gooding, he came into being, he was a black man, he's from the 56th Regiment, all black contingent in the Civil War. So he was one. If you go to the Boston State House, go at the front door and you see that little plaque right there, that statue right there. He was in that battalion, and eventually he wrote a letter to Lincoln, and he had 2 questions for Lincoln. One question was, why is it that the black soldiers are paid half the money that the white soldiers are? I don't understand. We're fighting, we're putting our lives on the line. He didn't understand it. I don't understand it either, by the way, but he didn't. The other thing he questioned too is, why is there separate barracks, separate food, separate equipment? The white people, they got better food, better barracks, better equipment, and they have a section of the black people in a small part of the camp and didn't give them very good equipment. He never got an answer, by the way. Okay, next. Basher was a great boat designer. He designed a lot of the whaling ships. He was a born black slave. He was considered to be the best boat designer that we had in the whole country for many years. He won an award by the American Yacht Club for being the best boat design, but he was born a slave. That's okay. Next one. We go next. Next is Bradley. He was a very bright young man. This guy was like at the age of 9 to 10. They realized how bright this guy was. He was born a slave, never educated, but a very curious mind. He could solve mechanical problems very easily. He could build a motor. You could give him some piece of equipment. He could put things together and do things. So they said, this guy deserves to be helped. He became an intern at the Naval Academy. That's what the Naval Academy looked like in 1850. He was given a job there to work with the intern. The irony, though, is that he could design, and he did. He designed 4 or 5 different motor ships, different kinds of ships, electronic devices that would help for the war. But as a black man, you couldn't have a patent. So he had to give his designs to somebody else who made the money. And he couldn't profit from that. Okay, next. And the last one, this guy is William Epps. He was a black medical entrepreneur. And he was wanted to help the indigenous people as much as he could. And he wrote a book called Natives of the Forest. And that became a very most best-selling book, but it showed how what a tough life the indigenous people had here in Nashville. They were treated very poorly. They were stolen, they were treated meanly, and so on and so forth. And the irony for him was, even though he talked a lot about alcoholism, he died of alcoholism himself. He died at a very young age of drinking too much. So I think I'll sum it up by saying, as far as I can see, we were not too nice to a lot of people. I think we have to really. I'm not afraid to confront it. I think we should confront it. I'm not thinking, I'm not saying people are wrong or right. It's not a moral question. I mean, it's a historic one. That was the thinking of the time. The church didn't stop it. The laws didn't stop it. The history of the church for hundreds of years were allowing slaves. So people say, well, of course, what's wrong with slavery? It's like women voting. It's like saying, today it'd be crazy. But back then, why? Women's voting in 1800? Why not? Why should women vote? They should have that power. So it's comparable to that, I think. So I would appreciate it if you consider buying a book. I'll sign this for you. Any questions or comments? Nobody's sleeping. That's good. I appreciate that. I didn't hear anybody snore either.
No, I think it was good. You guys
Questions? Oh, we've got time for one or two if you want.
You vaguely alluded to Cotuit and
Yeah.
slavery in Cotuit,
Mhm.
families.
Right.
Do you have anything?
I have no names.
Okay.
Maybe your family? I don't know. You look awful guilty. I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
Wasn't Ben Franklin an indentured servant?
Uh-huh. Yeah, they had what they call career indenture. If you want to learn a trade, a white man could go to a carpenter or something and say, I want to learn how to be a blacksmith or whatever. And they would take you in their wings for 3 years and become a servant. Interesting. So read more about slavery. But if you get a chance to go to Sturbridge Library, I strongly recommend it. There's a lot of interesting books you can read about that. All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.